Garrison Keillor once said that English was the preacher's language because it allowed you to talk until you thought of what to say. And and I suppose that when you get to what you say, then now you're ready to get behind the pulpit and start saying, you know. And there's this, I think there's this difference between saying and pronouncing and putting on the robes and wearing the, you know, adopting the pontifical tone and just talking with people. Because I think talk is really what really makes civilization run more than preaching, as it were. So with that in mind, I'm going to inflict a really long presentation on you that may or may not allow a whole lot of talking, but what the heck, we'll just give it a try. This is a lot of this. Some of you, there are some people, there are some veterans here who have seen my talks before. Richard Vernon back there, I used to work for. He's the former editor-in-chief of Linux Journal. He's trying to hide, and my sister Jan is back here in the fourth row. Anybody who has the goods or wants to know more of the goods, she's back there as well. This is a topic, the independence revolution, I just came up with for this particular talk because I've thought in the last few weeks that the term independence is more important than I'd thought it was before. So I thought I'd just play with it while I pull together some points from other presentations I've done. I'll let Google do the introductions. How many people here use Google on a daily basis? Everybody. Now here's penetration, right? So if Linux Journal is my day job, I write for Linux Journal. This is the latest edition. The Clue Train Manifesto is a book I co-wrote with three other guys, David Weinberger, Chris Locke, and Rick Levine. This started as a rant on a website and somehow turned into a book. As far as I know, it's the only book that started as a website, and it continues to sell. It's like the hardcover, which hasn't actually been printed in several years, though Amazon apparently has a giant cache of them. It's like still number like 1,200 on Amazon, which amazes me. But every 3 or 4 months, I get a check for 11 cents for sale of Audible rights in Indonesia or something like that. It's never been a huge money maker, but it's had a lot of notoriety and influence. My weblog has been around since '79, and a lot of people ask me, well, how do you find time to write this every day? And my response to that is, how does anybody find time to do email? Because it's the same thing. Mostly I'm answering email in public. That's a lot of what the blog is about. And Doc Searls IT Garage is a new site that's attempting to at least experiment with the idea that we can create a magazine that starts first as a website, kind of like we created a book that started as a website. Maybe we could do it with a magazine. There's a whole story behind that I won't bore you with yet. The interesting thing, though, is that if you look up Doc Searls on Google, you get 171,000 documents, 58,000 some say Linux Journal, 20,000 say Clue Train, 109,000 say Weblog, and 60,900 say Garage, and that's only been around since April. And I only put a few things in it every day. There's some weird kind of effect that happens here. Writing in public and having people link to it is by far the most leveraged thing I can possibly imagine. And there's no real strategy behind this. I'm just blabbing in public and stuff happens. It's kind of amazing. So at the last minute, I thought about, we might have a better chance of talking about stuff if I say a bunch of stuff that people might really disagree with. So these are a bunch of points that I want to make, and maybe we can argue about them later. I think mass communications is more about mass than communications. Communications isn't delivery. We talk about communications as delivering something. Information is not a commodity. The biggest market changes happen when demand gets the power to supply. I think that's the biggest thing that's happened with the net. And the net causes those changes. And the net isn't just a medium, it's a place. Think of it as a market, like as a marketplace, literally. Authority isn't command. We think of authority as this guy has authority, so a lot of other people will obey him, right? And it's not. It's a grace given to sources. If somebody's an authority, if they belong in the reference section of our lives, then that's something we give to them, and we get that. That's a grace that comes in the net. Knowledge isn't capital. It can't be managed either, nor can independent people. I don't think those things are unrelated. The net has no bottom or top. It's a world of ends. Its architecture has been called end-to-end. There's some dispute about that, but there's general agreement that the net has an end-to-end architecture. David Weinberger, one of the Clue Train co-authors, and I put up a site that was sort of a successor to Clue Train called World of Ends, and if you go to worldofends.com, you'll find that. I can explain more about that later. So Uh, and oh, by the way, this whole thing I'll put up on the web also. So if you don't want to take notes, it's okay on this. It's fine. In modern terms, I feel like I'm playing Morpheus to your Neo. You guys are Neo, I'll be Morpheus. You remember how that ends? Neo like kind of moves way past Morpheus, and that's. Do you all familiar with the Matrix? Oh, not as many as go to Google. Okay, so you don't know who the hell Neo and Morpheus are. You haven't read the Bible or watched it, as it were. Well, the Matrix is to me is the most important science fiction movie of all time. We'll get an argument about that, but it has this. The notion behind the Matrix is that the world we experience is in fact a great big construct, and we're all just batteries in a giant mainframe that's entertaining us in some way, and we're not really experiencing this in the real world, because the real world has been blown up by the humans a long time ago and the machines run it. Anyway, so I feel like I'm here to do the hardest thing anyone can do, which is change your mind, literally. And my main subject is markets, but it's one among many. And I have different definitions of markets than most people, so I'm hoping to change your mind about that. And I want to change the way you think and talk about all of them. So that's like a small, modest ambition on my part. The notion, take one of these, you'll be fine. There's this notion in this idea that, not idea, it's part of the plot in the movie is Morpheus tells Neo, take the blue pill and stay where you are, or take the red pill and see how deep the rabbit hole goes, and then he realizes that, oh my God, I'm just a battery in the big machine. So, and then a whole movie results out of that, and then two more that aren't nearly as good. But however, the first one, it remains a classic, and the red pill remains a valid metaphor, and so I'm going to use it. So here we go. There really is a matrix that tells us what to do and think and say. That's my point. I actually believe that the movie The Matrix is about marketing. It's about markets. There is a matrix that tells us what to think and to say. And the real matrix isn't so much marketing, although I like to blame marketing. It's this set of concepts we use to make sense of the world. And I'm going to go into here. You're going to have the shortest Cognitive Science 101 course you've ever had. It's a course I never took, but I've read about it. So but I read it all the time. By the way, I went to Guilford College, though I studied here. This is my favorite library in the world back when it was still it was the only open one that had open stacks, which is really, really freaking cool. And Perkins over at Duke, which I hated at the time for that reason, had closed stacks. You had to go and requisition them and bring them down and get identified. It was a silly thing. I just love the stacks here. But anyway, the real matrix is this set of concepts we use to make sense of the world, and we're not conscious of them. We don't know we're using these concepts. But they do our thinking and talking for us. An awful lot of the time, we don't really know that we're just essentially not so much puppets, but we're leveraging this whole set of concepts that aren't conscious to us. So the real matrix is metaphors. And when we studied English, in my case, several thousand years ago, and actually I didn't study it. I took it, and then I gave it back when I was done. But later, I learned all about it. Like I did. I took 3 years in German in high school, and I gave them back when I was done. Never used them. So we think and talk in terms of other subjects. That's what we do. In terms of is really the key thing. There are whole vocabularies that we borrow when we're talking and thinking about something else. And those subjects are like what we're talking about, but they are also entirely different. So herein lies the irony behind all understanding. This does not equal that, therefore this is that. It's a weird thing. So it's an irony behind all understanding, but not necessarily beyond it. So here are two examples. One is time, and the other is, and that's the best symbol I could find for life. That's a DNA chain. All right. So, I jumped ahead. I shouldn't have done that. Okay, I was going to do a little test, but it's cool. We think about time, and we talk about time in terms of money. We save it, we waste it, we lose it, we invest it, we spend it, we set it aside. It's entirely unconscious. But there's something precious about time that money is very handy for describing. But we borrow this concept of time. It's unconscious. I want you to save me some time. So time has this value, right? Okay, so time is money. So what do we think, and don't answer this if you've already been through this little lecture, but what do we think about life in terms of? What's the box of words, the vocabulary we use when we think and talk about life? Any volunteers? Journey. Bullseye. So yeah, life is a journey. Life is travel. Birth is arrival, death is departure, choice is a crossroads, careers are paths. We get stuck in a rut. We fall off the wagon. You know, we keep our eye on the horizon. You know, when somebody's dead, we say they're gone. Where did they go? Well, they traveled to some other place. He's in a better place now. You know, it is, what's that? They went to the beyond. You know, we cannot help. We can try all we want. We cannot help conceiving life in terms of travel. It's almost impossible. There are other metaphors we use for it, but it is the primary metaphor that we use to understand life, and it's totally unconscious. We just have this box of words. It does a lot of our thinking and talking for us. Metaphors like this are what allow us to finish the sentences we don't remember how we started, how to start the sentences we don't know how we're going to finish, and how we can hear each other and not be able to repeat back verbatim what the other person said. It's because we buy into the metaphors that they're using. Oh, he's talking about life. We got travel going on here. Fine, I got it, right? This happens all the time. It happens with everything. It's just that it's not so obvious with some things as it is with others. With time and life, those two are relatively obvious. So they're both what are called conceptual frameworks. You got a framework, and you frame your understanding in terms of those things. Stuff that falls outside the framework doesn't necessarily make it. We don't use it. It's like it's invisible. So George Lakoff, who is the father of cognitive science and who teaches at UC Berkeley, and who's an old friend of mine. I define an old friend as somebody I actually haven't seen in 3 or 4 years, right? So, but George says we frame all politics, and politics is interesting right now, especially because we're in a political season, in terms of nation as family. Here's a nation, and here, in fact, is our family circa 1978. So, and they fit nicely in there. That's a slide, a little visual I could stick in there. But there is behind our understanding of the country and of politics this notion that the nation is a family. A lot of other things are family too, but the nation is a family. So why should the best people be punished? This is the weird thing that George Lakoff heard Dan Quayle say in his acceptance speech in 1992 in the Republican National Convention. And George, being a cognitive linguist, said, I mean, he's hearing this thing. It's an applause line, and all of the Republicans are clapping. Yeah, right on. Why should the best people be punished? Well, Dan Quayle was talking about graduated taxation. You know, you tax the wealthy people more than you tax the poor people, and George thought, I don't understand, and I'm a linguist, so maybe I ought to understand. So he spent a bunch of time figuring out what the conceptual framework behind political rhetoric, I shouldn't call it rhetoric, it's a whole other thing, behind political speech, behind political talk. What were the metaphors that were being borrowed by these guys to talk about what they were saying? So to make sense of it, he says, you needed to know first that the best people are the richest, and you need to know that taxation is punishment. And as George also points out, if you ask a conservative, do you think some people are better than other people? He'll say, of course not. Nobody's better than anybody else. And then he'll go off and talk about how the best people shouldn't be punished, right? So a lot of this it's unconscious. There's a set of assumptions that goes behind it. It's actually very complex. But you also need, like this whole vocabulary, a box of words borrowed from where? So it's borrowed from the family. Now he says the conservative word box has a consistent set of ideas behind it. And these are the words you tend to hear, you know, character, virtue, discipline, toughness, thrift, respect, hard work, enterprise, property, rewards, punishment, common sense. And the liberal word box has other ones, you know, like fairness and opportunity and so forth. But he's a liberal. It didn't bother him what the liberal box was, but it did bother him what was in the conservative box. So, and he said, I want to understand these people better because they're selling their ideas. They're coming across here. You know, somehow Reagan got elected. What happened? Right? He didn't know. You know, he's a good Berkeley liberal guy. Thinking, well, I don't know, he's, you know, the dumb people elect the dumbest person or something. And he says, wait a minute, there's a reason this guy got elected, and I'm not going to insult the electorate. I better understand what it is this guy's using to sell what he says. And he very respectfully wrote a book. It came out in 1995 called Moral Politics, What Conservatives Know That Liberals Don't. Because he said the liberals didn't know that they had a worldview and that was based on the family, and the conservatives did. So when conservatives talked about family values, they meant something a bunch of people understood, right? And the liberals said, well, family values, that's like their issue, so we'll let them talk about family values, and we'll talk about fairness and opportunity and the environment and a bunch of other things that fail to sell, right? So he says conservatives and liberals think in terms of different idealized families. The conservative ideal is what he calls the strict father model, and the liberal ideal is the nurturant parent model. And I'm unpacking this particular example a little bit, not only because it's seasonal, but because it's just really interesting and complex. So different family models tend to yield different political worldviews. So in the conservative model, the world, first of all, is a dangerous place. It's also competitive. This is very Darwinian. You know, we have these guys fighting against these guys. There's always conflict going on. And you need a strong, protective, morally strong leader who stands up to evil. And your highest values are strength, obedience, loyalty, respect. The whole Boy Scout oath, if you read it out, right? Self-discipline, trustworthy. You know, you defer your goals, and so forth. Trustworthiness. Wealth is a good thing. Freedom is important. Liberals, on the other hand, believe the world is a good place. And by the way, he says that the strict father model doesn't have an equivalent. It's like the strong mother model or something like that. He says, no, it's more like a nurturant parent thing. The world's a good place. Children are born good and need to be made better. And the highest values are empathy, caring, responsibility, fairness, cooperation, community, yada, yada, yada. But it includes freedom. And he says, actually, if you list out all of the values for both groups, for both worldviews, you actually have most of the same items. They're just prioritized very differently. You know, like loyalty and obedience are at the top. Yes?
But they also have different meanings to the different groups, don't they?
Right, because the context is different. Right. I mean, so when you talk about, sometimes the meanings are you know, knee-jerk in ways that are about competition, for example. When we were at the beach, somebody mentioned, we were playing charades, and there was one of the books that was a charade question, or a charade item was, it takes a village, right? And like the lone Republican at our little beach group, you know, so somebody says, oh, this is by Hillary Clinton. He says, bitch, right? I knew where he stood, right? And that's a litmus test. You know, conservatives, not conservatives, but especially listeners to talk radio, you know, really, really, really hate Hillary Clinton, right? For whatever reason, you know. Any of you read Dave Barry about that? He said that if you go back to the founding of the Republic, you find that even back then, all Democrats had as their creed that they really, really, really had to hate George Bush. And the Republicans, going all the way back, it's like they really, really, really had to hate Bill Clinton, right? You have to get your hates right. And who knows why, but I mean, that's a whole other subject. But there are these different worldviews. But the important thing is, the world is a dangerous place, and it's also a good place. It isn't that complicated. You know, it's much more complicated than that. You actually need both sets of priorities in different circumstances. Really interesting point that Lakoff makes is that just because you may have this kind of politics doesn't mean you don't live this kind of life, or vice versa. And he says there are derivatives of this in morality, in the way morality is understood. In the conservative model, for example, they have the moral, what he calls moral order and moral strength. Strong is good, weak is bad. You reward strength, you punish weakness. This is why welfare is so abhorrent to conservatives. Wait a minute, these people are failing. You don't reward failing, you punish failing. And as a matter of fact, rewards and punishments are a big part of how you raise children, because the world is competitive, and a world is going to be like that, and you want to be stern and strict with your children, right? So now an interesting thing, and he says this yields a moral order. The bell curve is very, very important to this particular worldview, because competition yields an elite at one end and total failures at the other end, and a big average group in the middle, right? And if you're going to succeed, if you're going to prove your strength as a human being, you are going to try and move as far to the right in that bell curve as you can. Now, an interesting thing, he says, is that most academics are political liberals, and in their professions are profoundly conservative. There are good students and there are bad students, and you reward the good students and you punish the bad students. There's a total moral order around it. We absolutely value the best, and we punish and wash out the worst. And it's as Darwinian as it can possibly be, right? Now, and of course, the liberals come and say, well, so you've got to get some fairness in here. We have to treat some of these people as an opportunity and the rest of it. But it generally doesn't work. So, well, the tests over here say this guy missed a bunch of things, and too bad. You know, that's the world. And if they get out in the real world, it's going to be tough and the rest of it. So there are these little weird ironies going on. So it's complicated. But my point is that there are a bunch of subconscious things going on here. And we're going to get to what they mean. So conservative political rhetoric has at least one big advantage, which is a dangerous world is more interesting than a nice one. You can make movies about this, and you make advertisements about that. That's where I borrowed that, right? So, you know, and it's a lot simpler too. You're all going to have to get out of here, right? It's so for just about everything, war is the handiest box of words. War is like the universal metaphor source, right? You know, like I don't know if General Patton actually said this, but George C. Scott put it so well, you know. Compared to war, all other forms of and human endeavor shrink in significance, he said, right? Without the harsh and whatever, the lost throat that I just had there. Anyway, so it's a handy box of words. So we got this box of words that, and I know this as a reporter, right? You know, you sit down and say, well, what's the story? Let's just have what we'll just use, this sounds like a real conflict, it's competition, so it's war. So we have attack and campaign and command, defend, dominate, entrench, flank, force, kill, destroy, beachhead, cover, bomb, target, blow away, the rest of it. So, and it's very handy for lots of stuff. It's handy for business, it's handy for politics, you have a political campaign, you know, somebody's, you know, failing, somebody's entrenching, somebody's trying to have a level playing field, the other one's calling it a battlefield. It's great for sports, totally borrow it for sports, it's wonderful for sports. In fact, sports and war metaphors are almost completely interchangeable. There are some significant differences I may get to later if I remember to put that slide in, but I don't know. They're great for religion, you know, onward Christian soldiers, right? A friend of mine who's a priest points out that I think, and I don't know the Bible that well, but he said, as a matter of fact, Jesus referred to himself as king like maybe once, and mostly as brother and other things. Yet in most religions, you know, the ratio of king to brother or a rabbi or some other things is like this huge thing, because we want him to be Lord and in command and the strict father and all that kind of stuff. When, you know, his message was maybe not so much a strict father thing, but maybe the advertisement on the right. Anyway, and it's also good for marketing. So why is that? You know, why is war so good for all those things? And an answer comes from our friend Jerry. Some of us here know Jerry Sulfin. Among the many things that I've done in my life that Paul didn't mention is I worked briefly for a parapsychological organization that was very loosely connected, to the point that they didn't know was there, to Duke University over on Irwin Road in Durham. Studied the possibility of life after death, and it's dead now and it hasn't reported back. But anyway, so. But Jerry and I I was moving into his house on 1810 Lakewood in Durham, this old house, and we were cutting a hole in the ceiling, and out of nowhere, Jerry asks this question, which had no context whatsoever. He said, "What is the basic unit of consciousness?" And without even thinking, I said, "It's the story." I don't even know where that came from, but I guess because I was a journalist and stuff, and I thought it just came to me. So anyway, that's what he asked when he was sawing this hole. So the basic unit of consciousness is the story. I haven't slipped off of that idea since then. So, and you know, as any good assignment editor can tell you, stories are all that really interest people. Stories are what it is. So here's, you know, bombing in Iraq kills 7 Marines. Well, you know, like 300 kids died in Russia too. Does that matter as much? Well, why is it doesn't matter as much? Tar Heels step up and aid Floridians. They just, you know, there's a, you know, the section people read most is this one right here, is the sports section. Why do they read it? It's nothing but stories. It's nothing but stories. The whole thing is nothing, it's pure stories. That's what sports exists for. You know, this happened to be Hurricane Andrew because I couldn't find a good enough picture of the latest hurricane. But what makes the story interesting? This is Eric Raymond. I think Eric actually has spoken here. Eric is a hardcore libertarian gun nut and in many ways the father of the open source movement. And I was telling Paul, he talked me into going shooting with him and made sure I got a big 45, like he had a big 45. And there were all these, like, it was called Geeks with Guns, and it's like at this gun range behind the cop station where all the guys with giant, bigger than SUVs. They run over SUVs with these things, you know, and gun racks in them and stuff. And so here's a bunch of geeks in the back of this thing getting ready to shoot guns. I'm afraid they're going to kill each other. And Eric is actually cross-eyed, and he's not allowed to drive because he can't see any further than that. He's reading a book called Island of the Sequined Love Nuns during a muster on a geek cruise when he's supposed to be listening to what's going on with the lifeboats. But anyway, And so when he was playing with the gun, he's like, he blew away. I couldn't believe that he actually did. He's like, blew away, because he had to use the human forms, not the targets, but the human was like right through the heart, blammo, blammo, blammo. Interesting. Anyway, but he has a crazy story. He's an interesting guy. He's an interesting character, and there's a point behind that, because every story has the same three elements. And this is, I read about this from in a book called Writing to Sell by Scott Meredith, who is this big deal, probably the most famous literary agent of all time. And he had this really cool book called Writing to Sell. And these are his points. He said, every story has the same three elements. And those elements are, that's Linus Torvalds there, who's the creator of Linux. The first is identification. You have to have identification with a character, right? I mean, the reason that we care about the bombing in Iraq killing 7 Marines and not the blow up of the school in someplace we don't name in Russia that involve people we don't know is because we can't identify with them. Or if we can't identify with them, it takes a little bit more effort. But you have to identify with a character, and whole populations don't work well enough. A better chance we'll know the names of these Marines than of all the dead kids, for example. So, or this guy. This is Bill Gates in his mug photo from after he got arrested for drunk driving at age 19. I like the smile on his face. It's like even then he knew, right? It's, dude, it's cool. It's cool. I'll buy you later. Here's Kobe Bryant winning, winning a trophy, and here's Kobe when he's busy being, going through his court case. An interesting thing about sports stories is that, and we were talking earlier in another meeting about objective journalism. Okay, so if we're being objective about journalism, we're going to show pictures that might be truly objective as well. But pictures always illustrate who won, right? And if somebody wins, Kobe wins, he's happy, right? And if he's under, it could be he had this look when he was doing something else, somebody just asked him the time, or who knows, But you always use the pictures out of all the ones you're getting that illustrate, the simplest point about it, right? It's not necessarily even fair or accurate, but that's what we do. The second thing is a problem. You always have to have a problem. No story ever starts with happily ever after, right? That comes at the end, or it maybe never comes at all. It's not interesting if it does that. And you have at least movement toward a resolution. If you don't, you have something turning the pages, insisting that you turn the pages because the problem is still there, and there's at least some movement. If the whole thing is over, then like let's say you're at the Dean Dome and it's you paid a lot of money for the tickets, but it's late in the fourth quarter and the team's up by 30 points. The struggle now is getting out of the parking lot, right? The game's over, right? So you got a whole other story going on now. But that's what stories do. You have identification with a character, you got a problem with a struggle, and they're moving toward a resolution, right? So with all that as a preamble, what's the story of markets? Because that's the point I wanted to talk about today. So what's a market's character? And what do we mean when we talk about markets? But what do we mean, what do we think and talk about markets in terms of? Because that's the key. You borrow some box of words to talk about something else. What do we talk about markets in terms of? Anybody want to try to take a chance at that? We actually think about markets in terms of many different things.
Well, a warfare model.
Battlefields. A market's a battlefield.
Disagree.
Right. Yeah. Well, we often talk about the market is a battlefield. It's a playing field. It's the that's one. Right. Yeah. Over here.
Kind of like life, growth, and extinction.
Life and yeah, as a like an environment or something. That's good. I don't have that one in this list, but that's good. Any others? What's that?
Trade or exchange.
Or an exchange. Very good. Yeah, an exchange like this, the stock exchange, the commodities exchange. Right. Where two people are having a transaction, there's a market going on there. Richard. Culture?
Yeah, there's an article on the Onion about this advertising guy talks about how San Francisco is his favorite market.
Is it what market?
All the things about San Francisco, it's just the best market. Latino market, black market.
Right. It's a category. Yeah, those are categories, and they're demographic categories. So we talk about markets primarily as categories. We'll talk about the automobile market, or the computer hardware market, or the commercial software market versus the non-commercial software market, or whatever. We'll talk about markets as categories. we talk about markets as exchanges. There are these official places in buildings where people go to exchange commodities. We think of, markets out in the world as places where exchange takes place. We think of them as demographic groups. So when I used to work in radio, one of the stations I worked for, we were with the 18 to 34 market, right? Like everybody in that age group is going to want the same thing, right? But that's, it's a demographic group. There are regions. I read the other day about the China market. Like everybody in China wants the same thing, right? But it's a region. That's a market. So, and demand. We say there's a market for something if there's demand for it, right? And we speak of selling, and marketing is a breed of selling, kind of. It's this other thing you do in order to make selling happen. There's an interesting distinction there. My wife, was and still is in her own way quite successful in business. When I first met her, I was a marketing consultant, and she was very successful in the retail business. And I was talking about the difference between, why was it that in companies that had sales and marketing organizations that it was always the sales guy that ran it instead of the marketing guy? And I'm busy being a marketing consultant. Why can't the marketing guy get full respect? And she says, well, a simple reason is that sales is real and marketing is bullshit. Here's your answer. And I asked her to unpack that, and she said, well, no, here's the deal. Sales talks to customers. Marketing's not allowed to talk to customers. That's sales' job. Marketing can't touch the customer, but sales can. So what's left for marketing to do? Be strategic, right? So marketing gets to be strategic, and sales gets to have the job of actually talking to the customers. They're in conversation with the customers, even if they're pushing stuff at customers. And I said, okay, you got it right there. So, but there's this thing where marketing is sort of an adjunct to selling. And then there's this notion that markets are targets. Your market is this thing that you aim at, whether it's any one of these other things. Your target could be Thailand or California, or your target could be driving demand, as we say. There's this whole automotive metaphor that goes along with driving stuff, and demand is one of those things. Or your target could be the stock exchange or some category or other. And behind those, however, is something else. Markets itself, these are all the little targets. And most of the time we see markets as distant things. They're these things that are way out there. It's hard to reach this market. You have to reach it like it's some hard thing to get to. But they're not. Markets are real places. And that's the thing. If we go back up here, all of these things borrow. We say, the lingerie marketplace or the rug or the furniture marketplace. It's a place. In the Clutre Manifesto, we said the first markets were markets. They were actual places. The place that we call a market is that thing. Markets are real places. We've just forgotten how real they really are because we've abstracted them into all these other things. We assume that the things that they serve as a metaphor for are the real thing, and we forget where we came from with markets. So what were markets in the first place? Well, the first markets were markets. There were these places where people met to do business and to make culture. And many of our surnames label our ancestors' roles in real markets. If your name is Baker or Farmer or Cooper or Weber, if it's in German, or Marchand, if it's in French, Brewer, Smith, Armstrong, all of those different things. Our surname Searls is probably derived from a Norman name for somebody bearing arms, namely a soldier, probably. So there's a role. Our roles, the roles we played in real marketplaces were what we were called, right? So why don't we name ourselves Bill Broker, Bob Forklifter, or Sue Agent today? Right? Nobody's doing that. Right? Why don't we do that? And the reason is that industry won the Industrial Revolution. There was this thing going on that I was going to do slides about and I never got to it, called the Enlightenment, that gave us the country and other nice things like that. And then along came the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was a wonderful thing, and it gave us the world we have today. But it actually won over the places we call markets and replaced them with something else. So crafts lost, all those things that gave us our surnames before. Individuality lost. Independence lost. Industry replaced crafts with occupations, which we also call jobs, right? In the industrial age, everybody had a job, right? We all had, you're recruiting for a position, for example, right? Like you're going to be a cog in this machine, So, and that position is always somewhere in an org chart, and the org chart always looks like a pyramid, right? You got the one guy at the top, and you have more people in between. There's a very funny cartoonist whose blog is gapingvoid.com. You know, he's already laughing over here, named Hugh MacLeod. He's this Scottish dude. He's very funny. I couldn't find it. He has this triangle. It's a pyramid, and it's divided like this, and at the top it says sociopaths, and in the middle it says sycophants, and at the bottom it says losers. That's a and you read that and you think, holy crap, this is really kind of true, right? So in 1980, Alvin Toffler said we're entering the information age. He's the guy who came up with this notion of the information age, and he did it in a book called The Third Wave, which makes sense, you know. But the interesting thing is we still conceive business in industrial terms. You know, the big flywheels of understanding that carried us along for the last 200 years are still spinning away, you know, that were developed back when we had, you know, when everybody, you know, left home and started, you know, the farm and started working in factories. Those are still around. So, for example, we still conceive business largely in terms of shipping. We can't help it. That's the primary conceptual metaphor for business. And so that's why we load or move this stuff we call content through a channel for delivery to a consumer or an end user. I always hated this term content. I remember when the dot-com thing came along, and for some insane reason, not an insane reason, it's actually a sane reason, we had this industrial notion. So suddenly it's like, wow, the net's here, it's a cool thing, it's a medium, and you know, it's just like TV and radio, only bigger and different, but, you know, and everybody's got it, sort of. But, you know, why don't we put malls on it? Because we put malls on the regular world, and otherwise we can put malls here, too, and we can do this thing called capturing eyeballs, right? We're gonna capture eyeballs. We'll have sticky sites so people can't get off them. They're like fly paper. So we're conceiving human beings as flies. People who have infinite choice of 10 zillion other things, we're going to have a sticky site that's going to make them stay, rather than have a stink about it. You're not going to want to go there, right? But no, they just got billions of dollars anyway, right? So, John Perry Barlow, how many of you guys know about John Perry Barlow? He's a brilliant writer who penned a number of the Grateful Dead's songs, among other things, and he's very active on the Well in the old days. He's a real polymath. He said that, I love this line, he said, I didn't start hearing about content until the container business felt threatened. Right? So, you know, the publishing business, the broadcasting business, the people who package content and ship it, suddenly, you know, oh, this is how we conceive it. We have more of this stuff, and it's all content now. And it's, you know, and I thought, wait a minute, I'm a writer, but all of a sudden I'm a content provider. I'm referred to as this content provider, you know. And, you know, like what I write gets strapped in pairs onto a skid and sold at Costco, right? It made no sense to me, but suddenly I'm going to do content. You know, and so the job of every business, we're told, and this is it's in economics classes, right? You add value because there's this value chain. And where does the chain run from? It runs from the top of the pyramid to the bottom of the pyramid, and right outside the company, from the relatively few numbers of people in the company to zillions of people out there in the world that we're going to call consumers. So that's how we conceive business. So the deepest legacy of the industrial age is the few to many model of business. And this model idealizes small numbers of big producers, each with countless consumers. The larger the number of consumers and the bigger the company providing the larger number of consumers, the better, right? And my friend Jerry Mikulski is an enemy to the word consumer. He says a consumer is a gullet who lives only to gulp products and crap cash. That's what a consumer is. When we talk about the consumer, we're actually talking about a very, very, very crippled and disabled customer, right? Because we're going to limit their choices. That's what a consumer is. When you're just consuming, you're just kind of like sucking up stuff that people give you. So, you know, the characters that matter most aren't customers in this system. Because a customer you might actually have to shake hands with and might actually have a relationship with and the rest of it. It's consumers, they're these disabled people, right? So they're not even people, they're just the consumer out there. So we need to care about the net as a character. And the reason I say that is because we have this new environment. The net came along, it was deeply misunderstood in the dot-com era, fatally, colossally, grandly misunderstood, obviously. I mean, at the peak of the bubble, something like $26 billion a year were going from venture capital companies, from venture capital investors, into companies, new companies, temporary companies, just these fake, barely there, Western storefront Quonset hut with columns in the front companies, right? With billions of dollars, like $26 billion a year were sent to these companies in 3 area codes alone in Silicon Valley. That amount, $26 billion, exceeds the gross national product of over half the countries in the world. It gave us a reality distortion field that was almost incalculable and drove up property prices and a whole bunch of other things. So what's the net? If we look at the character of the net, what is the character of the net? So character, as much as anything else, is where you come from, right? I come from New Jersey. Jan comes from New Jersey. There's something about that that's still with us. We don't talk like that no more, but that's where we came from. I'm from New Jersey. What exit, right? There's this whole thing that goes along with that. Our voices give it away. Our frameworks give it away. Our ways that we understand the world are derived to some extent of where we come from. This also applies to companies. Apple is always a very interesting study for me because a few years ago, a guy named Mark Stevens, who's gone by the name of Robert X. Cringely and is a brilliant writer. He's got a column that runs on the web at PBS, I think, or NPR, or someplace like that. But anyway, it's there, Robert X. Cringely, and it's called The Pulpit. And he had a book a few years ago called Accidental Empires: How the Boys of Silicon Valley Made Their Millions, Battled Foreign Competition, and Still Couldn't Get a Date, right? And he had this really good show on public television. It was about 7 years ago. It was when Steve Jobs was still at Next, and when his hair was all still black to match his shirt, right? And his short Yasser Arafat beard also matched his turtleneck shirt that he special ordered from somewhere in Japan or whatever it was. And so he's interviewing him, and he says, so Steve, what do you make of Microsoft? And Jobs leans back and he tenses his fingers, and in the voice of the character in Sympathy for the Devil that Mick Jagger uses in that song, that pleased to meet you, hope you guessed my name kind of voice, he says, they have no taste. And it was a freaking bullseye. He's right. Microsoft has no taste. It ain't there. But Apple has nothing but taste. They're all about taste. Jobs has taste. It's brilliant, and it's a big part of what they're about. This is a very tasteful computer, right? What they do is all tasty. They're little Wi-Fi base stations. You get it from Linksys. It's got 2 rabbit ears on it. It's this ugly blue extruded plastic. You get it from Apple, and it's a little space station. It's this little flying saucer. It really throws off people in the security thing at the airport. What the hell's this? Explain that. It's a Wi-Fi base station. You say, hook it up, make it run. Anyway, so what's the character of the net? Where does the net come from? To some extent, you already come from. Like Steve comes from taste, right? So again, we have identification with a character and a problem with a struggle and moving toward a resolution. This is what I'm caring about right now. Is what's the character of the net? And first of all, its architecture is end-to-end. We've established that. There's this nature to it that's an end-to-end thing. And my friend Craig Burton, who's the gentleman who was more responsible, I believe, for the success of Novell than any other human being. Brilliant, brilliant guy. There are people at Microsoft that have told me, nobody has ever understood how to compete with us better than that guy. And he's brilliant. And he said, think of the net as a hollow sphere made of the people and resources it connects. The interesting thing about the architecture of a sphere is that any 2 points in a sphere are visible to any other 2 points through the hollow space in the middle. And he says the important part about it is it's empty in the middle. It's hollow. There's nothing in there to get in the way. So as soon as somebody comes along and says, wait a minute, we're going to get in the middle of the sphere and intermediate for you, we're going to help you out, right? It subtracts value. As soon as anybody tries to do that, it actually compromises it. And who was it, Whit Diffie or somebody, who was it that said the net routes sees censorship as, John Gilmore said, sees censorship as an obstacle and routes around it. Essentially, it's like, wait a minute, you're in the way of the nothingness in here? Please move aside. A guy named David Eisenberg, whose site is eisen.com, he used to work for AT&T, and AT&T at the time they probably has made more fatal errors without dying than any other company out there, I suppose. But AT&T wanted to get in the middle of everything, and that's what phone companies want to do. And so he wrote a piece called "The Rise of the Stupid Network." He says, here's how the new network works. Here's how the network works. All the intelligence is on the outside, and it's comprised of the people who are there. Trust them to make things work. What you do to facilitate this is be as stupid in the middle as you possibly can. Just take care of making sure that the thing is up and works, right? That's your job. But get your intelligence out of here and trust the intelligence at the periphery, the intelligence on the outside. So Craig's idea is that the hollow sphere is really the best way to imagine the net. Coincidence, the world works the same way, and there's kind of hollow too in a practical way. You can't really cut through it, right, to get from here to there. You're going to have to go around the outside. There's, and what the middle of it, the mass in the world does is it provides gravity. In a similar way, the nothingness in the net does that. So think of it as a world of ends. I talked about that before. This is a line that Mark Andreessen, I interviewed him when Netscape open sourced Mozilla in 1998. I did that for Linux Journal. And Mark just said this. He just tossed off this line. He said, well, technology trends start with technologists. Most obvious thing in the world. Big news for marketers and sales guys, right? But in fact, technologists start things. They start things. They make things happen. So what were the technologists up to when they started this world? I jumped. I don't have. Yeah. Well, these aren't in order. That's okay. Let's see. I may want to jump ahead. Oh, wow. I missed a part. Well, okay. Let's see. I know what I'll do. I'm going to jump out of this and tell you the story of Linux instead, because it's just fun. Then I'll go back to the other thing. This is Sam over here has seen this here. Some of these other guys have seen it. But people, this is like by request almost. Like people always read. This is I'm calling this suburban Linux legends. I talked before about stories, and every community has a sort of mythos about itself, right? This idea that of heroism. And in Linux, there's this one. Is that you all know what Linux is, by the way? Most of you. Enough of you don't know it, so you don't matter. Okay, not enough of you know. Okay, Linus Torvalds is the guy who wrote it originally, and he came from Finland. So he came from Finland. The other one is this sort of Geeks Got Cute because he came up with the penguin as a symbol for Linux. And there's this other one, which is world domination, which is something that Linus threw off. He had a speech that's sort of famous called, by the title of World Domination, and his whole notion was, we're going to dominate the world eventually, just count on it. It's actually sort of coming true. So these are my son, my youngest son. We have an interesting situation in my family. I have 4 kids whose ages are 35, 34, 33, 31, and 7. So this 0-year-old came along when I was almost 50 and my wife was not that far behind. And he was a total surprise, and he was a lot of fun. And so for Christmas, somebody gave him this thing called penguin pile-up, which is where you need extreme eye-hand coordination in order to pile them up on this thing where they fall down. He didn't have that, but he had imagination about how to organize them in a military way. Right? So, and the thing is, if you take a Sony camcorder and shoot still pictures from about a quarter-inch away, they stop being cute and look really menacing. So, like insects are cute until you get right up on them and say, oh, shit, man, this is really ugly. So Linux world domination goes like this. This story is told by a 4-year-old and his old man. That's Jeffrey there tearing the head off a promotional penguin. That's what's happening. They came from Computing's Antarctica, starting with a few small cells. They grew larger. Under inspired leadership, they took some hits, tended their wounded or worse, suffered losses, got lost in theory, and caught up in religion. They talked it over, got working together, fought back. See, it's a story. And finally triumphed over IBM, Sam's employer. Because the funny story with IBM is that when I first started with Linux Journal, I had this meeting with IBM, and it was like, come meet with the guys who wear very dark shoes in a secret room up here in the hotel, and we'll tell you our Linux strategy, right? And this is in the first Linux world, whatever it was. And when I went up there, they said, well, we're experimenting with Linux, so we put it on our web sphere on it, and we're putting on it a couple servers, and we'll see how it does. And I said, well, what gave you this idea? I said, well, some of it started to show up over the transom, just started to show up. And I said, well, kind of like PCs started to show up after you guys started selling them, I guess, right? So, and then the next, these things are 6 months apart. So 6 months later, suddenly IBM has a giant booth, and there's all kinds of crap going on, and they say we're spending $2 billion and we're promoting Linux and so forth. And I meet with them, and now there's a whole room full of people, and they're all like Moonies about it, and they got buttons and pins and penguins all over the place. And I said, well, what happened? And they said, before it was sort of this secret, maybe we're looking at it kind of thing, and now you guys are like crazy for it. So what happened? I said, well, we did a survey, and of course, if you're IBM, you don't need to survey the whole world. You just survey yourself, So they because you're big, and so they surveyed this technical division, and that had 600 people in it, and they said, well, we're going to survey for 6 levels of Linux awareness. Bottom level is knows how to spell Linux. Top level is hex kernel code, right? So how are we doing in there? Okay, we're doing fine. So they had so they did this survey, and they found that all 600 could spell Linux, and 150 of them were actually hacking kernel code. So what happened, and what's happened in a lot of other companies, is that in fact the engineers were kind of taking over. They'd made a bunch of decisions. If you work for IBM, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but you've got 5 or 6 old PCs that aren't going to run the latest Windows, and what are you going to do with them? Well, Linux is laying around over here. You can just put that on there and see it and run Apache or make it a Samba server or some other thing like that. So this is, anyway, it's an interesting story, so it's a fun thing. So, all right, having done that, and I'll close that, and I'll see what the layout of this is. Where did I go wrong? Take my glasses on. Oh, I see. That's 2 slides here go later. That's what it is. Okay. These are the O'Reilly books. Yep. You know what? I'll just come back to them. I'll just jump ahead. There's a... Yeah, I'll skip the Howard Dean one too for now. Okay, here we go. Go this. This is where we were going. So the NET's founding fathers built it to support civilization. If you read some of what Doug Engelbart was talking about, or Licklider, Larry Roberts, or there's a lot of a lot of talk about civilization and other things. I don't want to over-characterize it as that, but there's a thread here. These guys were not here mostly for business. Paul Barron and some others actually did well in business, but that wasn't the idea. And if you look at civilization, this is a really great drawing of civilization. It's a great abstraction of civilization by Stuart Brand, who's sort of a famous figure. He's the first person mentioned in the electric Kool-Aid acid test. He's the father. He's one of the father of the Whole Earth Catalog, among other things. And he wrote a brilliant book called How Buildings Learn that includes the line "Form follows funding," which is one of the best lines of all time. And another one, there is no urge more human, including sex and hunger, than the urge to alter a permanent structure. You buy a house, it's a permanent structure. No, we're going to move this room, we're going to move that wall, and the rest of it is a crazy thing that we do. So he started an organization called the Long Now, which is building a clock that goes bong once every 10,000 years. The whole idea being, like, maybe we'll care about fossil fuel that we're using up that took 10 billion years to produce and so forth if we have a longer view. So as part of the long view, he's organized a concept of civilization that has nature at the bottom, and then culture above nature, and governance above culture, and then infrastructure, commerce, and fashion. And the idea being that each one in turn sits on top of the slower one below it and relies on the slower ones below it for support in some way. Okay, it's a little bit simplistic in some ways, but it actually helps organize thinking about it rather well. So I don't think the NET's founders were coming from fashion and commerce. They were coming from down here. They were building infrastructure that had its own governance and its own nature built in. It had its own nature at the bottom with culture on top of it and governance on top of that. It produced an infrastructure that did not come from commerce. Like, all due credit to IBM and all due credit to Sun, which did some brilliant work, and a lot of other vendors, if it were up to them, they never would have invented the net. They never would have invented something that commoditized so much of what they sold. It just wouldn't have been in their nature. So this civilization is host to huge conflicts. And they center around infrastructure. So certain big and old commercial interests want to govern it. They want to say, well, we want governance to come in here and help us with infrastructure. We're coming down from up here. And technologists wanted to govern itself, for nature and culture to drive and support its governance from the bottom up. And so infrastructure is what goes under a platform. It's the NET's geology, right here. So infrastructure is inclusive of all those things. And the infrastructure of the NET that we rely on, that Paul, among others, deploys, comes up from down here. It doesn't get imposed down from above. So it supports what relies on it. It has no secrets. It's free. It's free in the sense that it's freely available. Obviously, there are costs of deploying it here and there, but it occurs in human nature, which is a critical thing. It's naturally independent of other things. And this is something I came up with David Weinberger. There's this thing we're calling NEA, this idea that when we talk about what are the characteristics of the net. Again, we're talking about the net's characters. Nobody owns it. Everybody can use it. And anybody can improve it. And that's where it differs from geology. We're making our own, human nature makes the net, and we continue to improve it. The net gets better every day because new standards come along. RSS is one of them, and there's an allied effort by Sam and some other people called ATOM, and it's one of the emerging set of standards that allows anybody who writes something on the net to have that spread out to the world. In other words, you notify the world that you've just said this, right? And services like Technorati, which I'm on the board of, have as a goal searching and finding what you wrote or what anybody wrote out of like 3 or 4 million sources within 7 minutes after it's published. So in other words, if I publish something here now, and I'm using RSS, and somebody at Google is using Atom, it's a similar standard, with Blogger. Blogger's owned by Google, but there are like 1 million Blogger blogs. And they publish something. Within 7 minutes, Technorati finds it, which means this is how you search for stuff that's too new for Google. And this is a whole area where that wasn't there before. The Technorati is calling the world live web. The whole notion of the web being a live place rather than just this library where stuff is stored is all new. We were talking at lunch about how the whole directory structure implied by weblogs is chronological, and it's giving us a definition of the web that's a largely chronological thing that can be archived. Very interesting stuff. In any case, it's being improved on a constant basis. And guys like Sam here and others are among the people who are improving the net as we go on. So Hollywood's anti-net forces, on the other hand, don't understand infrastructure. So we've got, here's got Michael Eisner from Disney here and Jack Valenti from the Motion Picture Association, and they look at this and they see the net come along and they say, duh, what happened, right? And interestingly, Rob Glazer of Real Network said, well, what happened was, this is what moves fastest and this is what moves slowest, and infrastructure came along faster than commerce. It pulled the rug right out from under them. They didn't expect that infrastructure to change that rapidly, right? A whole new market. They used to have a distribution system that allowed them to control the record stores and the rest of it. And all of a sudden, like, the net came along, I was like, whole new thing going on here. Anybody can get music from anybody else. The whole peer-to-peer infrastructure, point-to-point of the world events could all inform each other and sing to each other and the rest of it. And too bad, right? So they think, oh my God, how can we possibly control this? So they don't really know or care where the net came from or what it means to civilization. They only understand content and distribution. They don't understand infrastructure that forms and changes faster than business and fashion. They feel severely threatened by it, and they want to control the uncontrollable. And that's not a knock on them. This is what captains of any industry that feels threatened by whatever it is do. It's really the big flaw in the way Microsoft sees Linux. Microsoft speaks about Linux as a threat, and they talk about it as if it's another vendor. And it's not. It's a project by a lot of people, including their customers. So, if they stop conceiving it as in this hyper-competitive model, we're at combat, they're a threat. Microsoft needs threats. It's just the way they work, and they can't help it. But there's a whole other subject. In any case, that's what goes on. So Techies want infrastructure to support business. This, by the way, was the Jabber team. Jabber's open source instant messaging. And average age of these guys was about 17 when I took that picture. It's pretty amazing. Jeremy Miller here was the guy who invented Jabber. Am I wrong, or is Apple going to come out with a Jabber thing with the next round? I don't know. In any case, if you're using Apple's iChat, it's using the Jabber protocol. It is probably either Jabber or Simple or some other combination of those is what's going to allow your Microsoft Network instant messaging to finally talk to your AOL instant messaging. In any case, they wanted to support business plus the rest of civilization. Infrastructure in turn supports markets, so we've got a little market picture from earlier. And markets are up here in fashion and commerce. And there's an issue about proposing perspectives. Because while the commercial workers don't see the free and open sources of infrastructure, the free software and open source techies don't see the creative nature and accomplishment of commercial interest. That's a nature thing. So down here, They're not really, you know, if you're down here in geology, you're not necessarily seeing what's going on with the snow and ski, right? But that's a, you know, that's sort of the way the world is built. And right now, Hollywood's bigwigs are pushing for extreme net regulation. These guys want to turn the net into a regulated content distribution system. They want to turn PCs into supply control devices. Companies like HP are playing right along. Oh, great! You want to put digital rights management in these things? Great, put it in there, so that when you stick a DVD in here and it's not the right DVD, you can't play it. You know, or you go to some website. This is in the future, right? This is the version they see. You go to some website. You might not be able to look at what's in there. You may not be able to get what's in there because there's a little thing in there that says, "Oh, illegal content." Got copyright flags on it, slows things down. In Hollywood, a huge amount of energy is sucked up by what they call clearing rights. You know, and a lot of stuff ends up on the cutting room floor because somebody shot a picture of Franklin Street and didn't clear that picture with every brand that's on the side of the street. And they go up and down the street clearing rights and all kinds of crap. And that's the way they work, and they think it's great, this is wonderful. And maybe it is in their kind of isolated world where this is normal, but in the world of the web, it's major gum in the machinery, right? So, and they've had success with copyright law and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that passed in 1998, and they're not going to stop. So there's a deeper battle here, and it's really between metaphors, because Hollywood sees the net as a plumbing system for intellectual property and other content, while the geeks and techies of the world see the net as a place, as a commons, it's a term they use, where people can make culture and do business. And the truth is it's both, right? It actually is it is a plumbing system in a literal sense. It's a plumbing system, but it behaves like a place. So you've got both of these things going on. And what we need to do is save the latter from the former. Then that's what we're up against right now, and that's part of what I want to talk about. So markets operate at three levels. Now this is an interesting way of understanding the story of markets. One of you back here mentioned exchange is like the fundamental way we actually conceive markets. And I got the construction that I'm about to give you from two completely different people. One was Eric Raymond, who I showed you earlier, who's hardcore libertarian and an atheist and a total techie. And the other one is from a Nigerian theologian that I sat next to once on an airplane named Shayo Ajiboye, who explained how natural markets work to me. And this is what I got from a number of people after Clue Train came out. They said, wow, markets are conversations. That's a really cool concept for a guy from the first world who's actually never been in the third world and didn't know that all markets, in fact, are actual conversations if you're out there in an environment where supply doesn't control demand and doesn't set prices, and you discover prices inside of a conversation, and everybody you meet is no more than one distribution layer against the source of the goods. It's a whole different thing. So, but at the very least, both Eric and Shayo said, at the bottom of every market you have exchange. If you don't have exchange, you don't have a market going on. And above that, you have conversation. And that's cool. You've got conversation because you're going to be talking about stuff. Inside the market, every conversation is a topic, right? You know, you have the automobile conversation. You can use it that way. But there's a third level above that, which is relationship. And where do we stand on time?
We have to be out of here about 5 o'clock.
Really? Okay, I'll rush through this. I won't explain that one any further. Yet we still talk in the language of exchange. So if we look at this particular construction, we even talk about exchange even when we're in a relationship, because when we say we're delivering services, if you're serving somebody, why is that delivering? Well, that's because we're still in that sort of shipping model, and we're still sort of stuck down at this level where all we're doing is exchanging stuff, or removing content, or adding value. So the post-Clue Train lesson number one is the markets are also more than conversations. And this I got from somebody just threw this out. He said, well, think about marriages. Are they just conversations? Is a relationship just conversation? Well, no. You know, there's more than that. Markets are relationships, and they're profoundly social places. In fact, companies can't help relating constantly with their markets. Unhealthy companies are filled with fear and hostility, and healthy companies love their work, their people, and their markets. They also trust them. You know, one of the best things happening at Microsoft right now is that they're letting their bloggers say whatever they want. There are like 500 bloggers writing about Microsoft's troubles even right now, because they just decided they're not going to ship their next operating system in one piece. And so And they're speaking freely about that. Relationships make stories. You know, this is what every love story is about. There's a guy named Mick LaSalle who went to East Carolina and was a movie critic for the San Francisco Chronicle. And back when he was at East Carolina, he wrote this piece that I thought was brilliant. He said he was actually making the case for classical music. He said, you know, here's why classical music is in fact better than rock and roll. All rock and roll is about 3 subjects. The first subject is, baby, let's please have sex. The second subject is, baby, ain't it great we're having sex. And the third subject is, baby, ain't it too bad we ain't having sex no more. And you can actually separate out all rock and roll songs into those 3 things. You know, you've lost that loving feeling, that's type 3, right? Baby, I need your loving, well, maybe that's type 2, or maybe type 1, right? You know, let's get it on is another. It's all. He says, well, I don't think that's what Mozart had in mind, right? That was his point. So in less profane terms, I explained this to my son, who is very much into oldies, and he's 7 years old, and he types the songs. He says, hey, that's a type 1 right there. That's a type 3. So, but relationships are stories. You know, the relationships are struggles. You know, there's that struggle. We're always moving towards some resolution, but never quite getting there, right? So you have identification with a character. So my point here is that you've got the 3 levels of stories that I mentioned earlier on, and we also have these levels at which markets operate, and there's a certain mapping that occurs here that I think works pretty well. And relationships also have passion. If you're, you know, passion brings companies into business, into markets, and together with customers. I always want to throw up when I hear, we're only doing what our stockholders want. That's just bullshit. You know, people don't go into business. I can't wait to go into business and give my stockholders what they want. You know, they go into business for some passionate reason. Something drove them into business other than that. And relationships are positive sum. We give our affection, we don't sell it, right? You know, love is something you give away, and you still have it, right? You don't. There's not a zero-sum aspect to it. They're not about exchange morality. This is another thing I got from Shio Ajiboye. He said that there's 2 moral systems. One is all about balancing books. You know, we owe favors. Our justice system is you pay for your crimes and all the rest of that. Our concept, the Western concept of karma, is you have this balanced system that's always kept up. But they're not about value for value or favor for favor. They're not about added value, returns on investment. They go beyond positive sum. Relationship morality is actually about mercy, understanding, forgiveness, and even love. That happens in markets. It actually happens in markets. We just don't talk about it because we have this very weak vocabulary about relationship and a strong vocabulary about exchange. And they're about transcending the self. They're about us and not just about me. And relationships are personal. So is business, within companies, between companies and customers. As markets turn into bazaars, again, that's a notion that Eric Raymond came up with. The companies that succeed will love their people, their customers, and the bazaar itself, and trust all 3. And relationships are between characters, the characters in the stories of their lives. You know, each with their own personalities, passions, ambitions, problems, and stories, and each independent. That's an interesting thing. And one of the reasons I brought up the political thing earlier, independence is actually a value that exists in both the conservative and the liberal worldview. It's equally valued in its own way by both. You know, working should be about loving what you do and who you do it with, and that's why they call it a living. And it's happening in a huge way on the net, and I haven't put up any of the evidence about that, but like, you know, eBay has like 100,000 people all making like over 30 million a year or some crazy thing like that because they've created a market where that can happen. So that's it, and we can do the Q&A now. We have 10 minutes left. Thank you.
I've been writing about marketing and sales, and just gave me a tool I never had before. Sales has more power than marketing because sales has stories, while marketing has only theories.
That's absolutely right. Well put. That's excellent. It's yours. Is it? I say that? I was overheard to have said? Well, good. Because I don't have it on this. This failed. So.
What word you used, he couldn't use.
Here, this is team memory, right? That's cool. Anybody else? Don't all jump in at once. Did I say that little?
It's so thought-provoking. It's difficult to know what to say or what to ask. It's a whole new paradigm.
Yeah, it is. It is. Or in the back over there.
Do you still believe that businesses need to open their access to their people through conversation? Or do you think that businesses have successfully reacted to that attempt to get past their infrastructure and have successfully reasserted marketing and the sales false front?
Well, I think it would be an error to say all businesses in some ways. After Clue Train came out, one of the companies I heard from very quickly was Johnson & Johnson, a huge company that has all these pharmaceutical concerns. They say, we love the whole idea of voice and speech and openness and the rest of it. However, we're severely regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Even our speech is highly regulated. How do we deal with that? And an interesting thing is, in the conversations I had with them, I went to this thing about, where do you come from? Where, and they went off on this whole thing. There was General Johnson, and there's General Johnson's creed, and there's a reason that it turns out that they sell Band-Aids at a loss because they're really, they're a caring company at some level, at some founding level that's going on, even if a lot of their speech is restricted. I've seen, it depends a lot. I mean, Microsoft keeps coming back to me because I really do think they have tried to do some things right. And I also think their personality isn't competitive, it's combative. They want to kill companies. They want to kill other companies. And they're not alone at that. Guy Kawasaki, who is the original evangelist for Apple and he's a VC who has Garage.com, I think is his company, says he always likes to have women read business plans because men tend to write business plans that amount to, here are the companies we're going to kill. And there isn't a customer out there who says, geez, I really want this vendor to kill off these other vendors, right? But that's, but I think if you're going to live on the net and you're going to deal with the net, you're going to have to open up in a lot of fundamental ways. And it's very hard in some cases, especially if the legal department's involved. It really is. And that's, and it's a tough thing for a lot of companies to do.
Instinctively, some of this exists without recognizing it. The only reason Johnson & Johnson survived 2 Tylenol poisonings is because they had a relationship.
Exactly.
Because they had a conversation
Right.
which was open.
Right. And at the same time that was going on, I don't know if you heard that, but there was this Tylenol scare where some bad person tainted some Tylenol and some people got killed, and they said, we'll own the whole thing, we'll fix it, we'll change what we do, and we'll be open about the whole damn thing. And people trusted them for that. And that was in their nature, where Audi at the same time, there was a sudden acceleration problem that in the long run it turned out it really wasn't their fault, but it looked like it was their fault, and they should have done what Tylenol did.
They're very German about it.
Excuse me. Yeah, it's a perfectly fine car. Just jump in, put the kid in front, see what happens. But it's but it was what's that?
Bhopal, another example.
Yeah, Bhopal, another one. Yeah, there's and sometimes they're conflicted. I mean, I think in many ways, like Hewlett Packard, for example, I see both things. The Linux people in Hewlett Packard say, well, no, we're kind of pushing them over in this direction. And I'm hearing from other people, say, oh my God, they're going to DRM out the wazoo, and a lot of these conflicts are exposed, and some of them aren't. It's not easy. I mean, in some cases, I mean, Apple's an interesting case with open source because they actually had a lot to do with the founding of the web. In some ways, they really do like open source, but basically, they're a profoundly closed company. They're very locked up tight. There aren't many bloggers at Apple, right, that you really know actually work at Apple. Whereas at Microsoft, it's like, here's my official Microsoft list of this many bloggers, and here's links to the people outside that are saying there are this many more bloggers, and that's an interesting thing. That at some level they don't care. That's fine. Let them do that. It's interesting.
Is it because they don't consider blogs tasteful?
Could be. I think it's just it's not. I actually think it's it's part of just the way they work. And talking about where they come from, there was a precursor to Clue Train was a chapter I wrote for a book published by a Microsoft guy inside. It was like an ombudsman that went between different divisions and settled disputes between what Dilbert calls battling business units. And they had just bought Web TV, and he read something that I wrote about how I thought that the web will win in the long run in some ways over television, and so he wanted to collect like an anthology of people writing about this subject. And when it was all over, regardless of what I wrote in that particular book, my wife at that time owned a little bar in San Jose, and this is a very controlled guy, and he was very, very foursquare and the rest of it. But he did drink beer, and I got him into the bar, and we sat down, and 3 beers later, I said, "So tell me, what is the deal with Microsoft?" And he said, "I would describe Microsoft as more school." I said, "What do you mean more school?" He said, "Okay, how many companies want to know your SAT score? How many companies want to see your GPA? How many companies want to see your college records? How many companies want to know you're at the top of your class? How many companies grade on a curve? How many companies invented the term campus, which they did?" He said, all the guys, it doesn't matter, there were lots of different personalities did well in that environment, right? There were the jock smart guys and there were the chess club smart guys, but he said, people who get along well in that weird kind of environment you have in school, are the people Microsoft wants, because that's what Bill Gates was and still is, and that's, he came from prep school, he went to Harvard, and that's what he understands, and he loves the bell curve. And he said, and he also said, how many companies can't go 2 paragraphs without describing themselves as smart? Read anything Microsoft writes about itself. We're smart. We have more smart people than it's this whole weird thing they've got around smartness, and it's part of their personality. And I actually think it's part of the openness thing. And I just thought of that. It may have to do with blogging. 500 of our smart people are blogging. It must be smart by definition. They work here, right? So yeah, I'll let you go first here.
It was interesting when you were talking about the industrial model and how that's changing in the information age. One thing that kind of remained unspoken, kind of implied, is that the industrial model where you have a few companies with an infinite number of customers is that and you've got this supply chain, is that you've got somewhat of a limited supply relative to demand. Am I right to read into that way?
I'm not sure what you're reading exactly, but I feel a need to say this thing, which is that. I don't think, the top-down producer-consumer big company efficiencies that allow those companies to exist is going to go away. A guy named Thomas Malone, who teaches at MIT, said that the most profound technology in the industrial age was the telephone. The telephone allowed huge companies to exist, and it allowed them to be hugely efficient. You can watch the rise of huge companies in some ways along with the growth of the telephone. Which I never even thought of before. I don't even know it's true, but it makes sense to me in some way. And I think that we need, what we have is this new ecology that includes a whole bunch of new stuff and a whole bunch of new conditions that we're just building out and discovering at the same time. And there's a lot of adaptation that's required by a lot of companies to that, some more than others. Publishing, broadcasting have a lot of adjusting to do. The pharmaceutical industry, almost none. The automobile industry, a lot, but not all of it, because not that many companies are going to be able to make automobiles. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
Well, they're going to lock this building, so.
Okay. Better to be locked outside than inside?
To do that. And so that means that we'll have to get locked up.
Thank you.